So let's start with the basics. The basics are the vray daylight system, and that is composed from vray sun and vray sky. So the most basic way you can light your scene is with sky only, and this is great for those overcast type of lighting scenarios or shade where the sun does not come directly into the windows, so you can get by with vray sky only. So to set up vray sky, you go to rendering, environment, and set up a vray sky map in the environment slot. Okay, and I'm going to drag and drop it in my material editor so I can edit some of the options. Alright, so before we render, I'm going to load my light test preset, and I'm not going to cover my render settings just yet. For now, just let's load the preset. Okay, go to room and render. As you can see, there is a sky outside the room, but the room itself looks very dark. And that's because by default vray camera is set up for bright daylight. Okay, so just go ahead and change the shutter speed to something much smaller, like 1/5 to 1/30th of a second with these default f number and film speed settings. So I'm gonna try for 1/10. And now the scene brightness is much more in line with what we would expect. There's another thing wrong with this render. Notice the weird color cast. The walls are basically neutral gray. They look sort of pinkish, and that's because the default color balance on vray camera is set to D65 lighting, and we want to change that to either neutral or daylight, and I'm going to go for neutral for now. I also like to turn off the vignetting and add it in post-production. So now we have a nice neutral render with gray walls. Right, so I'm gonna pause the recording, and here's our final render. So notice how the shadows are extremely soft and blurry, and it doesn't look too realistic. And the reason is that vray doesn't have enough light samples coming in from the windows. And we can help the renderer out by placing some light portals coming from the windows. And this is the most important step for getting a decent lighting result from vray sky setup. So just snap those light portals to the inner area of the window. Make sure the light is set to skylight portal and simple, so it lets the light in only one way. Make sure it's facing towards the room, not the other way around. And place these portals in front of every window. And this should give us a massive improvement in the shadow quality. And probably it's gonna make the room a bit brighter as well. Okay, and if I zoom in here, you can see some nice looking shadows coming from the lights. So that's the basic daylight setup. So sky portals make a great difference and should be always used with vray sky in interior scenes. Right, so if we adjust the exposure of our render, we're going to see that it's actually the sky is actually blue. So this is great for those clear days where sun is facing the room from the other side, so there's no sunlight coming in, and you have only this blue diffuse light coming from the sky. But if you want to make a gray overcast sky, you have to change some settings on the vray sky. So go to your material editor where we instanced and vray sky map from environment slot, turn on specify sun node, and change the sky model to CIE overcast. And maybe bring up the indirect horizontal illumination as well. And this is going to give us a warmer look with gray sky instead of blue. Okay, and you can see if we adjust the exposure, the sky is actually gray, as it would be on an overcast day. Right, as you can see, the overall look is quite different, and it's a nice result for bright overcast day. Okay, so this example has large square windows that are easy to cover with light portals. But what about some different scenarios where we have different types of windows, like these angled ones here, or maybe differently shaped windows, like this curved window or arched window here, or maybe even some skylights, and I'm going to show you how to light those examples as well. So let's start with this one. So this is pretty much the same thing, except we have different windows. But the basic idea stays the same. What you want to do is cover the windows with light portals. In this case, it's as simple as making the light portal first for the lower part, okay, like that, and then for this upper angled part as well. So just make a copy of that light portal, rotate it, and adjust the size. And try to make it fit, but try to make sure the light is not overlapping anything, as that can cause some glitches or additional noise, things we don't really want. Alright. I think that's close enough. So let's take those light portals and instance them to the other two windows. And that's pretty much it. Once we render, you're gonna see a nice realistic result. Okay, it looks pretty good. So let's go to our next example. And that's gonna be this arched window right here. So the best way to handle this situation is by creating a vray mesh light that mimics the shape of the arched window. And sometimes it's possible to generate this mesh from the window frame itself. For example, here I can just select this object, select this edge loop, and create shape from the edges. Okay. And convert to editable poly. As you can see, the normals are facing the wrong way. So we want to take that element and flip it around. Okay. like this. Otherwise, the light is not gonna go in, but it's gonna go out. And that's not really what we want. Alright. Okay. So now to create a vray mesh light. So let's create a vray light. Change it to mesh. And pick the mesh from the viewport. And as you can see, the mesh is transparent and it's converted to a vray light. Okay, and I'm gonna render the scene. And it should look pretty good. Actually, it seems that the light was changed from skylight portal to regular light, so I'm just going to change that back. So you could of course use a rectangular light, but the light distribution would look unnatural and the result would not be believable. So right now you can see the light fits on the shape of the window perfectly, and you can see more light here, and it falls off towards the sides as the window curves down. So always try to match the shape of your sky portal with the shape of the window. Okay, in our next example I'm going to show you that it's not always the case. And for example, you have a pyramid type window on top, and it's not really needed to create 4 different lights shaped exactly like those triangles on the skylight. You can get by with a simple vray plane. Covering an area like this. And the end result is pretty much almost exactly the same. So this is just easier to set up, easier to adjust, position. So there's really no need to match the shape of the skylight like this. And as you can see, all the light comes in from this rectangular area anyways, so it doesn't matter if it's if the light portal is shaped like the pyramid or if it just covers this rectangular area here. Maybe we just need to slightly move it downwards so it's not covering half of the frame here. Okay. And this should fix this little weird edge we have right here. Maybe that's just a reflection. Okay, like that. Right. And now we can render the scene and it should look good. Okay, so to reiterate, what you want to cover with the light portal is the opening that goes inside the room. It doesn't really matter if outside that opening the window is shaped like a pyramid, like a dome, like a prism, like a Santa Claus, whatever. You just want to cover the opening that goes inside the room. Okay, like this. If the opening would be round, you would make a circle, convert that to mesh, and use a mesh light there. If the opening is rectangular, you can get by with a simple vray plane light. Right. So next example is this room with large windows. Actually, they are huge. Most of the walls are transparent and you can see everything around. So in this case, you could probably get by without even creating skylight portals in the windows. There's plenty of light coming in, and the result looks pretty good. And the shadows would probably be pretty diffused anyway. Okay, so if you're in a hurry, you can just render as is without any portals. But to increase the quality slightly more, I'm gonna set up very light portals in the windows. And just as before, create a portal, make some instances, and cover the windows. And for these other windows, I need to make some copies instead of instances, since the size is slightly different. And that's close enough. Okay, it's probably gonna get quite a bit brighter. And the shadows will be slightly better, but still you can see there's really not much to talk about the shadows. So if we adjust the exposure for this camera, the render should look good. Maybe something like 40. Okay, 40 is too much. 1/25 of a second. Okay, as you can see, in this case, the outside is almost the same brightness as the indoors. And that's because all the light is coming in through these huge windows and huge light portals. Okay. The next example is a bit more interesting. And here we don't have any direct light coming in the room. What we have instead is this sort of extension that has light coming in from the top. So this is a common scenario for some basements or some skylights in the center of the house. So if I go to my camera, you can see how it looks. I put a 3 there just to make it a bit more interesting. And in this case, we do not want to cover the window that comes inside the room. We want to cover the opening on top of this area right here. So if we place a skylight portal here, the room is going to be much too bright compared to that area with the tree. So to make it realistic, we need a skylight portal exactly right here. Okay, and if I render, you're gonna see that the scene is pretty dark, and we need to bump up the exposure on this particular camera quite a bit. It's maybe 1 second or so. Okay, I think even more. I'm just going to increase the ISO as well. And as you can see, the light looks okay. There's quite a bit of noise here, and the GI looks patchy. And these types of scenes are always pretty difficult to illuminate. So you probably need to increase the light subdose, you need to increase the radiance map settings, or use brute force for GI. And it's going to take longer to render than the regular scenes. But if you want natural light, that's the price you gotta pay. So if it's possible, I would suggest using some artificial lights in scenes like this. So for example, you should turn on this pendant lamp here, maybe some lights in the background and stuff like that, just to bring in more light samples into the room, so it's lit more evenly and faster. And another type of difficult scenarios for V-Ray is where you have extremely tiny openings, extremely tiny windows like these. So the basic procedure is still the same. You create light portals, and place them right here, right in front of the windows. And I hope for the best. But the results are probably not going to be too great. So immediately you can see that it's too dark. I'm going to bring up my exposure for the camera. Okay, let's say 1 second with 200 ISO. And you can see this area around the window is very blown out. And we can try to get around that by adding some additional lighting to the room. It's sort of a fake, but in this case I don't think we have too much of a choice. We don't want very blown out corner right here and a pretty light scene. So let's say I'm gonna reduce the exposure. That looks better, but it's very gray. And it's still kind of blown out right here. So let's set that to 1/5. Okay, so that's about right for this corner, but the rest of the room is pretty dark. I'm gonna render the whole thing so you can see it. So there are a couple of ways to even out the lighting in this scene, to make the room brighter without overblowing this corner right here. And you can either mess with the color mapping, for example, change it from Reinhardt to exponential, and reduce the bright multiplier and stuff like that. Or yeah, you can do it in post-work if you're working with 32-bit images, or you can create a vray ambient light, and this is going to boost the overall light levels of the scene. You can choose to either boost direct plus GI, just direct, or just GI. I'm going to show you how it looks. And you can see the whole scene is much brighter, but we are losing some of the details in the GI pass. So the corners look too bright and the scene seems to lack contrast. And there's an option for trying to fix that, and it's the GI minimum distance, and you can increase that. So for example, 20 centimeters from the corners and the objects, the light will not be increased, so we should keep some of that detail in our render. And you can see the corners are more defined now and look a bit more realistic. So that's a quick way to boost the overall brightness of the scene without messing with any of the color mapping options or post-work. The result might not be the most realistic, but sometimes it's the easiest way. And if you think the shadows are too washed out, you can go and change that mode from direct plus GI to GI only. And this is going to boost only our secondary bounces and keep the primary light and the primary shadows as they were before. Right. Okay, so I'm gonna render the whole thing. Okay, so I think that about covers it for the basic overcast lighting. If you want to add a sunlight to your scene, it's very simple to do. For example, let's try this one right here. You just go to your vray light, vray sun, and create a sunlight. And I'm going to replace that environment map with the regular vray sky, which is going to have the blue color instead of the gray. Render. So this already looks too bright. So you can probably increase the shutter speed, decrease the shutter speed to 1/30th or something like that. And it's basically as easy as that. If you move the position of the sun, the sky will get adjusted automatically to change the brightness. So the lower the sun is, the darker the sky is going to be. So it's very easy to change the time of day from noon to maybe a late afternoon or morning or whatever else you need. Alright, so that looks pretty good. One thing to keep in mind when using vray sun is that for some weird reason, by default, the shadow subdivisions are set to only 3. And I should increase that to at least maybe 8 or 16, because by default all the shadows that are caused by vray sun are very, very, very noisy. and sometimes new users forget to check that option here, and well, the rest of the render is pretty clean. The shadows from the sun are still pretty pixelated and noisy, so keep that in mind. Right, so that about covers it for V-Ray Sky plus Sun.